He was only 7 years old, when the Empire decided his life was no longer his own. They came at dawn, soldiers in black coats, faces wrapped in cloth, eyes like blades in the fog, and they spoke one word that froze the entire village: Devshirme. That word meant the Sultan was collecting children again. The boy's name was Arban. He lived in a small mountain village, quiet, cold, and forgotten by time. Until that morning, mothers hid their sons in barns and basements. Fathers begged. Priests prayed, but nothing stopped the soldiers of the Empire. When they found Arban, his mother clung to him, screaming as if her voice could change the world. The officer said nothing, just nodded once. 2 men tore the child from her arms, and as they rode away, Arban watched her fade into the mist, her cries lost beneath the sound of the horses. For weeks, they marched east, dozens of children, barefoot, frightened, too young to understand what was happening. Some cried, some went silent forever. At night, the soldiers told them stories about Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's home of gold and marble. They said it was a place where angels walked, where boys could become princes if they obeyed. But the older ones whispered a different story about those who disobeyed and were never seen again. When the domes of Istanbul finally appeared on the horizon, Arban thought he was dreaming. But dreams don't smell like blood and incense. The city was alive, glowing, endless, and terrifying. And at its heart stood the great palace, Topkapi. At the golden gates, the scribes were waiting. They took down each boy's name and replaced it with a new one. Arban's name was erased. He was now Halim. "You have no past," said the scribe. "You belong to the Sultan now." And then the gates shut behind him. They said the Sultan lived like a god. But inside those golden walls, the children learned that gods demand sacrifice. The palace was beautiful, but beauty can hide horror. And for the boy once known as Arban, his nightmare had only just begun. The Palace of Silence. Discover what waited for the children beyond the golden gates, and why none of them ever escaped. When the gates of Topkapi closed behind him, Arban, now called Halim, stepped into another world. The air inside was thick with perfume and fear. Servants moved quietly through marble corridors, never speaking unless spoken to. Even the echoes of their footsteps seemed afraid to make noise. Halim looked around at the towering walls, the golden doors, the gardens that seemed too perfect to be real. It should have been paradise. But every smile looked rehearsed. Every shadow looked alive. He was led with other boys through endless courtyards until they reached a small courtyard where an old man waited. His robe was white, his eyes empty. "You are nothing," the man said. "You were born again today. Your old name is forbidden. Your old god, your old tongue, gone." He pointed to the sky. "Only the Sultan rules here. His word is the voice of heaven." The boys were forced to repeat those words until they trembled from exhaustion. Days became weeks. The palace followed a rhythm of silence and obedience. At dawn, they were trained to bow, to serve, to stand still for hours. At night, they slept on the cold floors of narrow rooms with barred windows. When someone cried, the others turned away. No one wanted to be noticed. The punishments were swift and quiet. A single mistake, a broken cup, a spoken word, and the boy would vanish. No one ever saw where they were taken. The next morning, their mat would be empty, and no one dared ask why. One evening, while cleaning the lower halls, Halim saw a line of men in dark robes carrying something wrapped in silk down a hidden corridor. He caught a glimpse of a small hand falling from the cloth before it disappeared behind a locked door. He froze. Another boy whispered beside him, Don't look. Don't ask. Just live. From that night on, Halim began to understand that the palace was more than a home for the Sultan. It was a place that fed on silence, a machine that erased names, faces, and memories. The children who entered were not meant to grow up. They were meant to vanish behind the gold. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the painted ceiling, Halim heard something. Soft footsteps, a whisper that seemed to come from inside the walls. A voice called his old name, Arben. The training of shadows. Halim begins to uncover the secrets behind the palace's vanished children, and learns what happens to those who remember who they once were. The morning after Halim heard his old name whisper through the walls, he was taken to a new courtyard deep inside the palace, a place the servants called the School of Shadows. The walls here were high and smooth, blocking even the wind. Boys stood in rows, silent, eyes forward. They were older now, sharper, but the fear in their faces never faded. A tall man in black armor paced before them. He did not introduce himself. He simply said, "You were brought here to serve. You will forget what you were. You will become what we tell you to be." Every day was a ritual of discipline. They learned to stand still until their legs went numb, to carry trays heavy enough to break their arms, to bow until their backs ached. Mistakes brought punishment, swift, precise, and public. The trainers called it purification. The boys called it disappearing. At night, Halim's dreams twisted between memories of his village and the faces of boys who vanished. He tried to whisper their names, but the others warned him. The walls can hear. Months passed. The children were divided into two groups. The strong were trained as janissaries, soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. The weaker ones, like Halim, were sent deeper into the palace to serve the inner chambers. He learned to move without sound, to lower his eyes, to become invisible. They called them the shadows of Topkapi. One night, while sweeping the marble floor outside the Sultan's private rooms, Halim saw something that made his blood run cold. A young servant, barely older than him, stumbled and dropped a tray of silver cups. The room fell silent. The chief of servants approached. He smiled, not in kindness, but in ritual. He touched the boy's cheek gently, then whispered something. Two guards appeared and dragged the boy away. The next morning, his mat was gone, his name erased. That day, Halim stopped asking questions. He learned what the palace demanded: obedience, silence, and fear. But the whispers continued. Sometimes, when the lamps dimmed, he heard crying behind the walls. Sometimes a voice, soft, broken, familiar, would whisper his real name again, Arben. And each time he heard it, something inside him refused to die. The palace could take his name, his family, his freedom. But it could not take the part of him that remembered who he was. And that memory would soon become dangerous. Whispers in the golden harem. Halim is sent deeper into the Sultan's palace, where beauty and terror walk side by side, and where the walls themselves begin to speak. Halim had learned to move like a shadow, to speak only when commanded, and to disappear in plain sight. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the world he entered next. He was assigned to the inner chambers of the Sultan's harem, a place draped in silks, perfumed air, and the constant weight of secrets. The walls gleamed gold, the floors were polished marble, and the gardens bloomed with impossible colors. It should have been beautiful. But beauty in the palace was always a warning. Halim quickly realized that the women of the harem were as trapped as he was, their smiles polite, their eyes watchful. Servants whispered of vanished girls who failed the Sultan's favor, and of boys who disappeared after a single mistake. The palace did not forgive, it consumed. He was instructed to serve silently, to fetch, to clean, to obey. He learned which steps must be taken lightly and which eyes could not be met. Every corner hid unseen watchers. Every corridor carried hushed warnings. One evening, Halim noticed something odd. A door at the end of the hall, normally locked, was slightly ajar. He caught a flicker of movement inside. Whispers followed him when he tried to ignore it. They seemed to rise from the walls themselves. "Do you hear them?" a boy next to him asked in a low voice. "The ones who vanished. They never really left." Halim froze. He had heard the whispers before, at night, when the candles flickered. But now they seemed closer, sharper, almost deliberate. Curiosity wrestled with fear. That night he crept closer to the forbidden door. The air was thick with perfume and dust. Through a crack, he glimpsed rows of small beds, empty, but for a few dolls left behind. And on the walls, faint scratches, names, dates, perhaps prayers from children who had once been here. A cold realization settled in him. The palace was alive in ways no one spoke of. It remembered every child, every servant, every whisper of fear. It was a machine that devoured innocence and stored it behind golden walls. Halim stumbled back into the corridors, heart pounding. He knew he could not speak of this. Speaking meant death. But the whispers followed him to his mat that night, circling his dreams. Even in sleep, he could hear his old name, carried on the wind through marble halls. Arban. The part of him that remembered his past had become dangerous. And in a palace built on fear and obedience, danger could mean the end of everything. The shadows were closing in, and Halim was learning that survival required more than silence. It required secrets, and courage he did not yet know he had. The Forbidden Door. Halim uncovers what lies behind the palace's hidden chambers, and the truth of the children who never returned. Halim had learned to move through the palace unseen, to obey without question, to vanish when danger approached. But the Forbidden Door haunted him every night. It was said that no boy who entered its shadow ever returned. Servants whispered about it only in trembling voices, and even the older Janissaries avoided its corridor. One night, when the halls were empty, Halim crept toward it. The door was smaller than the others, carved from dark wood, and sealed with iron. Yet he had discovered a loose hinge, a weakness that called to him like a heartbeat. He pushed it open. Inside was a room unlike any he had seen. Dust lay thick on the floor. Old beds, broken dolls, and tiny shoes littered the corners. Names were scratched into the walls, hundreds of them, and next to each, a date that ended abruptly. Halim realized with horror. These were the children who had disappeared. They had not left. The palace had kept them. A shiver ran through him as he stepped further in. On a low shelf, he saw bundles of cloth tied tightly. When he dared to glance inside one, he saw a small, folded uniform. A child's. And beneath it, a note. He did not obey. He staggered back. The air was cold, almost alive, and the walls seemed to pulse. Somewhere, far away, a whisper rose and fell. The faintest echo of a child calling his old name. Halim realized the truth. The palace did not merely take children. It reshaped them. It punished those who could not conform. It erased their past and stored the memory of their existence in this hidden chamber. And yet, it seemed to wait. Wait for the next mistake, the next slip, the next shadow. He shut the door quickly, but the image of the room stayed in his mind. He could feel it in the corridors, in the gardens, even in the faces of those who smiled but hid fear behind their eyes. That night, as he lay on the cold floor of his dormitory, Halim understood something terrifying. Knowledge could be deadly, yet ignorance could be worse. He had glimpsed the palace's secret, And with knowledge came a choice, to obey completely or to resist. But in a place where walls whispered and shadows remembered, resistance was not simple. It was dangerous. The boy once known as Arban, now Halim, knew he had crossed a line. He had seen what the palace did to those who forgot who they were, and those who dared to remember. Halim moved through the palace corridors, a shadow among shadows. Years had passed since the day he was taken from his village, yet the palace had not forgotten him, nor had he forgotten the boy he once was. The whispers grew louder each night. Names scratched into the walls, tiny hands pressing marks into the marble. All reminders that the palace stored every soul it claimed. Halim had seen the forbidden chamber. He knew its truth. The empire did not merely take children, it consumed them, folding their lives into its walls. One evening, he found himself alone in a room filled with mirrors. Each reflection showed not Halim, but fragments of the children he had known. Their eyes wide with fear, their faces pleading, their voices barely audible beneath the silence. He reached out to touch one reflection, and for a moment, the boy he once was looked back at him. Arban, the memory of home, of his mother's voice, flooded him. He wanted to scream, to run, to reclaim what was stolen, but the palace would not allow it. The mirrors cracked, and the images shattered. The whispering voices rose into a single, chilling chorus. "You belong here. You have always belonged here." Halim stumbled backward, realizing the truth. The palace did not merely erase names, it erased hope. Those who entered became part of its walls, part of its history, part of the endless golden prison. And even memory, the one thing he had held onto, could not survive against the empire's design. By dawn, Halim had disappeared from the halls, but the mirrors remained, and if one stood quietly in the right corridor, they could see him there, a shadow among shadows, a boy who remembered too much and yet had become nothing. The palace kept its secrets well, and those who entered never truly left. The boy once known as Arban, the shadow called Halim, existed now only in whispers etched into the walls, trapped forever by a golden prison that had claimed his life and his memory.